What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Behind the Door podcast. We're in our pretty sweet new digs right now. For those of you listening on audio, you can't see that, but it's pretty badass. We got the door behind us. We got a really good aesthetic going on, and we're happy to be moving onwards and upwards with this, man. Thank you for everybody who's listening in, and we're going to talk about a topic we haven't really covered yet. We're going to talk about juvenile justice. Talk about some of the work going on in Maine, but also hear from Jeremy about some of his experiences coming up in the Maine Youth Center. You've heard a little bit about it through the podcast so far, but it's a really important topic for us, here in Maine, but nationally as well, understanding that, youth incarceration is not the answer to any problems that we have in society, and treating trauma with trauma is something we talk about a lot on the podcast, and today we're going to unpack some of that with, how it applies to young people. And Jeremy, I know you've talked about it before, but, just tell us a little bit about your experiences with youth incarceration coming up in the Maine Youth Center before you hit the adult system, and how you think that affected you, early on going through the system.
There's no question that it plugged me into a network of other kids that were struggling and stuff, and it got me used to like being incarcerated, and there was no real, so the weight of like law and order and doing all it didn't apply at some point, right? Like, because I knew I could do time, and I was fitting into the system. So it wasn't like the youth center or whatever it was didn't become a deterrent at some point, right? It's not scary anymore after you've done it, and it doesn't really stop. It never stopped any negative behavior that I was involved with. You know what I mean? It actually made it worse because I got better at it. You know what I mean? Or I thought I did, and my whole perception on life at that point was about fitting in with these other kids that were struggling. You know what I mean? And then the abuse that was going on when I was there, you become used to that too. You know what I mean? And so you become like sort of desensitized to like society norms, right? Like how we handle things, how things are going on. Like you become desensitized to that at a young age when you're teenager and stuff like that. That's like, it shapes what's gonna happen next.
Yeah, it's interesting because for people listening in, when I got out of prison on the supervised community confinement program, I had been doing a program with some youth who were at the Long Creek Youth Development Center on Zoom with a very good friend of mine at the Maine State Prison. So we were doing some mentorship with young people who were also incarcerated, and the program stopped, and I won't go into the whole story as to why, but basically it stopped temporarily, and they said, when you transition out, we'll let you come do it in the facility. Mm-hmm. So I started going to the youth center, 11 days after I got out of prison, and working directly in person with young people who are incarcerated. And one thing that I found that was always fascinating, but also really, really sad for me to confront, was that a lot of these young people who are in that system look up to people who are in the prison, and it's almost like once they touch the youth prison, and I'm just going to call it what it is. A lot of departments of corrections, a lot of state governments will have you believe that we have youth development centers. And that's what ours is called. It's not a development center. It's modeled after the...
And I wanted to say something about that, too. So when I was incarcerated as a youth, there wasn't any fences around the facility, and they were in cottages and stuff, and, these buildings, and there were dormitories, you know what I mean? And we were outside playing basketball, basketball a lot. I think the type of stress that the youth are under now was different than when I was there, because I'll just say this, they were constructing what's now Long Creek Youth Development Center when I was there.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I got some time off my sentence if I shot this anti-violence TV commercial that was played on late night TV back then, and we filmed that on the basketball court of the Long Creek Youth Development Center, but they had built it, and really what I'm getting at is that prior to them building that, it wasn't like a traditional prison setting, right? It wasn't like brick and mortar. It was or it wasn't, concrete and steel, right? It was like the place was sort of open, and they built a prison there that's identical looking to the county jail or the main state. You know what I'm saying? Like there's no difference. And so I think that is a huge. So if you're going to get a youth ready to go to prison, you would put them in.
Yeah,
you groom them to become accustomed to doing time.
Yeah.
And like what becomes normal for these kids and really safe in a lot of ways. So right now, sometimes I'll go up and visit some kids that are getting out soon because like to connect them to resources, right? So I'll go there and I talk to them once in a while, and I've walked in there and it's like, it's identical. There's 12-year-old kids inside of a prison block saying the same things and trying to behave the same way that a grown person in a prison is trying to be like. You know what I mean? Yeah. It creates the culture for that kid.
And I've struggled in working in juvenile justice for the last couple of years and really advocating for young people who are incarcerated to understand the way that, people in authority try to frame it as, oh, it's not a prison, and like we're really trying to help these kids. And don't get me wrong, like there's a lot of really, really good people who work in the environment. People I grew up with, people I went to high school with who are good people. And I've met some really good people who care about the young people, like genuinely. But you try to explain to them that you can't call this something that it's not, because it's literally, I did 13 years inside of the Maine Department of Corrections, and this youth facility is modeled after the prison. Mm-hmm. Everything operates the same way. The doors are the same, the cells are the same, the blocks are the same. Mm-hmm. And like you said, you're grooming young people to normalize to the environment of prison. And then you wonder why it's hard for them to transition out, or you wonder why they look up to, adults in prison. And then we also have to name, too, that like the majority of them have family who have experienced incarceration before. So way before they ever touched the facility themselves, they were already learning about what it was like and being accustomed to that.
Well, it was pretty interesting. Last time I was in Long Creek, there was 2 or possibly 3 kids in there that were children of men that I did.
Yeah, that you did time with. Yeah.
And their kids are 12 years old, 10, 11, 12 years old, and they're incarcerated.
Yeah. I mean, in Maine, we don't incarcerate like super young people anymore. That's one of the, like, I say very loosely positive things, but we do still get 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds in there. And I don't know if you've experienced this talking to them, but like when I was going in the facility, they would ask me like, do you know so-and-so? And I'd be like, yeah, I did a lot of time with that person. Like, oh, that's my uncle, or that's my dad, or that's my cousin.
And that's the role model.
Yeah, and it's not just the role model, but also then the next question is like, oh, what's the prison like? And then you explain to them what the prison like. They're like, oh, that sounds way better than this place. And I would literally get so frustrated talking to these kids. I'm like, stop. It's not better. It's not better because I had a TV in my cell. Like, I understand that the living environment that you're in feels really tough, but incarceration is never better than anything. But these young people are literally grooming themselves to believe, like, this is it for me. This is what I'm going to do.
Well, that's the message. So part of my story and part of the way I've my recovery from this thing, you look back and you understand what your belief system was wrapped up in. You know what I mean? And so if I start to believe, like, so if the message that I'm getting is that, like, I've done this thing that's so bad that I'm going to be put in a prison cell for it at a young age like that, make no mistake about it, that kid's already believed that they are not worth anything and that they're going to end up in prison for the rest of their life. Because look at my dad, look at this, right? Like, I'm going to end up in prison. Like, that's part of their path, and they start believing that at 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 years old.
Yeah.
It's going to take a lot of work to unbelieve that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And that's really, that part that you just said is what it really boils down to for us in Maine and the work that we're doing to try to end youth incarceration, is understanding that it does take a lot of work, and that it's a lot less work to care for a young person and show them community and show them the opposite of whatever environment that they're coming from that's feeding them into the system than it is to try to unravel the effects of incarceration after you've confined them into a jail cell.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's interesting because a lot of people struggle to believe that, like, when you put a young person inside of a prison and you treat them like a prisoner, even if you're doing it, quote unquote, compassionately, like you treat them with compassion every once in a while, you're still locking them into a cell.
Mm-hmm.
They're still looking at barbed wire and tall fences and brick and concrete and metal and all these things. It's still, the aesthetic is the same.
Well, that environment becomes part of you.
You internalize it, right? It literally does become part of you. One of the things that I've always compared it to, not necessarily youth incarceration, but just incarceration in general, is like in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, when you have the people on the boat that are literally part of the boat, like they've got barnacles on them and they just kind of like melt into the wall and they become part of the actual boat. That's what prison does to you.
Right.
You become part of the structure. You become part of the building. It literally becomes part of your psyche, like this brick and concrete and the metal, what you look at day in and day out. And with young people, one of the things that's crazy to me is we know by and large in this country that, like, brain science tells us that their brains are not fully developed, right? That the decision-making functions of their brain, weighing risk and reward, is so underdeveloped that, like, science tells us young people are not good at making choices. And when they come from, adverse experiences and traumatic backgrounds, then their brain development even slows further. And so you put somebody who's got, all of these adverse experiences as a young person, and their brain is in the process of developing, into an environment like this, and that's where their brain develops. The things that are normalized are going to stick with them, and then trying to undo all of that when they come out of incarceration is like a Herculean task, right? It's not an easy thing to do, but we don't actually care for young people when we let them out. We put them right back into the environments that they came from.
Mm-hmm.
And we wonder why they continue to cycle in and out. And one thing that people might not know is the biggest predictor of youth incarceration, the biggest predictor of involvement in the juvenile justice system for a young person, is previous involvement in the system.
Mm-hmm.
So if we know that that's true, I don't understand why people believe that we're accomplishing something in our society by locking up young people.
Well, I know why that is. Because we've said this many times, is that, like, our society becomes ingrained to say this is a crime and you did this and you have to pay a punishment for it. You know what I mean?
Mm.
But, like, for our kids today, they are struggling with this, and there's limited resources to get any kind of help or to buy into any kind of help in the community.
Mm-hmm.
Which culminates lots of times in breaking the law or whatever, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then they get put in a box. Well, so not only do they get put in the box, but there's no real counseling in there. There's no real, like, reunification with the family. You know what I'm saying? The staff there is under you know what I'm saying, understaffed already. You know what I mean? Like, it's just the resources are not present to support incarcerating kids because there's no help on the other side.
Yeah. When I talk to people about Maine Youth Justice as an organization that I work for, and our campaign is to close down Long Creek, reinvest the Department of Corrections budget, their juvenile justice budget, into community alternatives and, like, care-based alternatives, and then repurpose the facility for a social good, like, helping with the housing crisis in Southern Maine or something like that. And the question I always get is, like, well, what are you going to do with the really dangerous kids? And I get in these conversations with people where I'm like, well, number one, like, kids aren't inherently dangerous. The situations they come from are what are dangerous. The things that are normalized in their life when they're young are what are dangerous, but they themselves are not dangerous. And if you have a kid who's never experienced love and care and they're lashing out, maybe, the answer seems kind of obvious to me, like, introduce them to something they've never had, normalize that type of behavior in them. But I ask people, like, what would you want if it was your child? If your child was struggling and your child was, having anger issues or mental health issues, what would you want from, for them to help correct those problems? And a lot of times the answers I get, especially from, like, quote unquote important people like lawmakers and police and people like that, is like, oh, well, my kid, would never, my kid would never do that. And I'm like, well, why? And they're like, oh, well, my kid is respectful and he has manners and, he's articulate and, like, I've raised him really well. I'm like, well, that's interesting because do you think, like, Did your kid choose you as a father or as a mother? Like, was there a parent draft when they were born in the hospital and they got to go through like the top 10 picks? And they're like, they look at me, they're like, no. And I'm like, okay, so you've just admitted that a lot of these young people who are coming through the system didn't choose the life that they lived. And so we have to choose better for them as a society when they do start to experience hard times. You know, like we can't get people to parent better. We can't get communities to care more. We can't get schools to function better. That's not the easiest task in the world. But what we can do is take a young person who's struggling and lashing out or you know, quote unquote committing crimes, and we can introduce them to something they've probably never experienced before, which is like people who care about them and healthy people who can guide them in the right directions and systems that, you know, look out for their best interests. And unfortunately, even if you're looking out for a kid's future and their best interest while they're incarcerated, you're not, because you're locking them in a cage at night and forcing them to deal with all of their trauma and their issues on their own for those like 10 hours in a cell by themselves with nothing else to do. So, you know, I kind of struggle with people who are like, oh, well, we can't close down the prison because these kids are dangerous. And it's like, no, you got to love children, right? You have to love them out of their struggles. You have to love them out of their misbehaviors. You have to be patient with them, you know, locking them away from society. And like you said, introducing them to an environment that, you know, completely goes against everything we want society to be, and only introduces them to other kids who are struggling, just normalizes that struggle as like, hey, this is a part of my life. This is what I'm going to deal with forever.
Yeah.
And I'm just, you know, from you for your story, because we talked a lot, you know, over the years about your experiences down there. And it was a whole different environment back then, like you've kind of already said. But, you know, now, all these years later, you know, what has it taken or have you, you know, healed from what you went through as a young person in the environment?
That's a good question, because it's as the years go on that I've been, you know, outside of a confinement, you start to kind of unpack, like, you know, and things get locked away a little bit. You start to unpack, like, what happened to you when you're ready to do that, I think. You know what I mean? Whether that's through therapy or whatever it is, right? But so like I was saying, like the things that are going on now are not the same problems. I don't believe it. You know, some of them are similar, but like it's different now. Right now, there's a class action lawsuit in action for the period of time that I was at the main youth center, right? And it's something I hope we can talk about soon, is like that period of time. Because like what I was saying to you is that I saw 2, 3, multiple kids of people that I was at the main youth center with, or the main, you know what I'm saying? Like, so there's definitely a connection between the generational trauma that's happened in my generation, that I was part of it. You know what I mean? They had some very obscure practices about what was gonna how they were treating us back then. You know, I've said this before. There was a period of time where you would line up. Everybody's in the corners. They would line you up naked and you would have to show your underwear to some other kid, and he would yell scrubs if you know what I'm saying. It was like like these things that happened.
Yeah,
I think we're still feeling the ripple effects. Is, I guess that's what I'm getting at, the ripple effects of what happened to us in that period of time. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I see a lot of men right now that unhoused, using substances, you know what I'm saying, like detached, that I was in the, like, you know, that was my basketball partners, you know what I'm saying, when I was in the youth center, you know what I mean? A lot of them have passed away. A lot of them are doing life sentences at the Maine State Prison. You know what I mean? Because this stuff got out of control, right? Like the sense of normalcy around that type of abuse, and really the mindset of just going, okay, you did this, we're going to put you away, and then not talk about what you're going through while you're in there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that to me is like, the metaphor of the door being in New York City on the street and people just walking by it.
Mm-hmm.
That's why that door was on in New York City, and we put it there because it shows why we are in the situation we're in, because everybody's just looking, is not taking a look at it. Like, and we're starting to now, I think, with these lawsuits, and you know what I mean? Like it seems like people are interested in holding people responsible for what happened, right? But it doesn't change it. It doesn't change the ripple effect that happened, right? It doesn't change the generation, the continued generational trauma that happened, right? But I will say this too, is that the change that I've seen is in like the Maine Youth Justice Organization itself, right? That was never a thing when I was a youth. You know what I'm saying? That there wasn't even
advocacy.
There wasn't really much advocacy going on, right? I was very impressed with the Maine Inside Out program when they were teaching the theater in there, like starting to allow our youth to talk about their experience in a different way. You know what I mean? I've never like the first time I heard about them, and I went to a performance. And it changed my life just to know that like these kids were in and they produced something so beautiful. With the help of some people that really cared about them. You know what I mean?
And can relate to their experiences.
Right. And it was those things haven't been present. You know what I mean? And we need more of it. You know what I mean? We need more advocacy groups. We need more people to go in there and teach our youth something. You don't need to donate, to advocate. You don't need to do that. So you can show up and show our youth something. You know what I'm saying? We can show up for our youth. You know what I mean?
We need these conversations to spread. Like, the advocacy can't exist in like its very specific lane of people challenging the authoritative bodies in order to make these changes. We also need regular people being invested. And it's interesting because when I heard you talking, it brought up a conversation that I actually had yesterday with somebody, and like prisons are literally designed to be invisible, right? Like they're tucked away. This is the model that we have, like 95% of prisons in the country, and don't quote me on that statistic, I'm just spitballing, but the majority of prisons in our country are tucked away in rural areas. Like, they're not in cities, they're not visible to people. And the same goes for our youth prisons. And the interesting thing is, I was talking to somebody yesterday about the work I do with Maine Youth Justice, and they were like, where is the youth prison? And I said, it's in South Portland. And this girl was like, where in South Portland? Like,
right next to the place you get your nails.
She was like, I know South Portland well. And I'm like, well, I explained to her, she goes, hold on, it's over by Red Bank. And Red Bank is a neighborhood across the street from the prison. I'm like, yeah, it's literally across the street. She's like, my sister lived in Red Bank. I've never seen a prison there. And I'm like, you're not supposed to. Like, it's tucked behind, right? You can see the sign, but you actually have to drive back there to see all the barbed wire and the brick buildings. And it's interesting because in a lot of ways, incarceration it invisibilizes you, because the actual physical structure is not, staring people in their face. So society doesn't have to confront it. So we take kids who are misbehaving and we lock them behind, fences and barbed wire and brick. And then we tuck the facility behind other things so you can't see it. And why would people come to question it? And the unique thing about juvenile justice is that there's anonymity. So we can't name young people who have committed harm, right? We have laws that keep the media from exposing their names and keep people in society who interact with them from knowing their identity. And so, like, literally when it comes to kids, we have created them as these invisible wrongdoers. And why would society invest in people they can't see and they don't know? And that's one of the biggest problems when we talk about why we need to close down the youth prison and create a different model. Because if we need to expose kids to healthy interactions, and if we need to expose them to community and actually getting them in spaces where they can grow and thrive and express themselves through art, like how Maine Inside Out does, if that's what we need, then we're not accomplishing that at all with this, this completely anonymous model of youth incarceration where we strip them of their identity and lock them away from community and society. And how can a young person heal in that environment when the only thing that people know about them is that they've committed a crime? And so it's interesting because I hear you talk about your experience and, like kind of narrating some of these things, even though it was a lot different back then. But then I also flash back to what you were saying earlier. The only reason I became interested in juvenile justice, because I didn't experience incarceration as a youth. I was like, I didn't get in trouble until I was 18. That's when I started getting in trouble. But when I started my 17-year prison sentence, I feel like 70+% of the men that I met at the Maine State Prison had been in the Maine Youth Center.
Oh, yeah.
And so in talking to guys and hearing their stories and getting to know, one another, and I'm like, in my mind, man, this is a major problem. Why are the majority of people who are in this prison have experienced youth incarceration? There has to be a correlation there.
Right.
And that's what kind of got me invested in wanting to explore, like, what are we doing with our young people that we're just grooming them to come to adult prisons? And then the other ironic part is a lot of those guys who experienced youth incarceration, they were the ones who subscribed to the convict code the most, right? They were the ones who, were the most stereotypical prisoners that you interact with. And then I started to realize it's because they were groomed to be this way through youth incarceration. And that's a huge problem for our society. If we want youth to be better and not commit crimes as they grow up and not be normalized into criminal thinking and criminal behavior, then we can't treat them like criminals. We have to treat them like kids. And, that's why this work is so important. And, on future episodes coming up.
I just want to say something about that, too. So it's really, the system is a system because of the laws that are created, right? So if there's, I think some of this, too, is about us as a society speaking to our legislatures if we feel inclined to do so, right? To help our kids, right? Because it's the laws that are shaped around the way we handle our youth that I think is getting in the way of really providing them help, because the system's only going to provide the money that's agreed upon, right?
Yeah.
The laws are the laws. So if if a police officer shows up somewhere, and the laws, it's black and white. You got to go to jail, and then you got to go to court, and then you got to go to Long Creek or a youth prison. Who can change that? But the way we carry our laws. So I think it's important if this conversation hits you, you got to talk to your legislature.
Yeah,
we got
lawmakers.
We got to figure out collectively.
Yeah.
As a society, if this is what we want, and that starts with us as individuals to take that action, right? Talk to your legislators, find out what's really going on. Do research? You know what I'm saying? Like,
connect with people who are in the advocacy
with people,
can teach you.
Yeah, like if you listen to the conversation and it's like, wow, like in a lot of ways it's like state sanctioned child abuse. Like people that I was incarcerated with as youth, I know. They were experiencing sexual trauma, where physical abuse was going on, like solitary confinement of kids that were young. You know what I mean? Mike Connors was I don't think he was 10 years old when he went to the youth center for the first time, right? A 9-year-old kid gonna need to be incarcerated with, you know what I mean? But what I'm saying is if the conversation hits you and you go, man, this isn't right, well, use your voice. You know what I'm saying? As an individual, step up and use your voice. Whether the person next to you is going to use theirs around this issue or not, we as individuals have to step up and actually care about that,
Yeah, no matter where you live, if you're living in California and listening to this episode, if you're living in Alabama and listening
there's shit going on there too. It's not right no matter where we're at.
No matter where you're at, do your research. Find the juvenile justice advocacy organizations, reach out to them, ask what's going on. And if you're in Maine and this episode is hitting you and you have questions, reach out to Maine Youth Justice, reach out to the Maine Prisoner Advocacy Coalition, reach out to Maine Inside Out, because Jeremy's 100% right. We have to correct the things that are going wrong in the places that can correct them. And so right now, when we're done recording this episode, I'm going to the State House to advocate for LD 1779, which is a bill to end youth incarceration in Maine and reinvest the DOC's budget into healthy alternatives that care for children and allow them to thrive. And we do understand that as frustrating as a process as it is to work with lawmakers and work with systems that are broken in order to, try to self-correct or, whatever you want to call it. But we as voting people who put these folks into office need to make sure that they know that we don't believe in models that are harmful. We believe in models that are caring. And we believe in models that actually, promote youth development instead of stunt it. And, it's interesting because it's something I bang my head against the wall about all day long is like, how do you fix a broken system within a broken system? But in a lot of ways right now, we only have two mechanisms. And one is exactly what you're talking about. Reach out to your local lawmakers and say, hey, I don't agree with the way that we're, doing juvenile justice in our state. And number two is like connect with the organizations and ask how you can help and show up at events where we're talking about these things and show up for young people, who need your help, who otherwise, because of the narratives in society, you would stay away from because they're, you think they're criminals, but they're kids. And so I just think that you're 100% right, that we have to get more people, regular people involved in caring about these things. And a big part of that is telling the stories of young people who have experienced this. And that's something we're going to do on this podcast, right? We're going to get with some young people in the near future and have them tell everybody their stories of what youth incarceration was like for them. And we're going to bring some of the advocates on to talk about the work that's being done and why it's important and the science behind it and the data behind it, just so we can really frame for people that this is a pretty significant issue, right? In Maine, it's not huge. We only average 23 to 25 kids locked up at any time, but in a lot of other states, it's thousands. We got thousands of youth experiencing the trauma of incarceration, and it's not a reality that any of us should accept because it's not a reality any of us would want for our own children. And so it is important to continue these conversations and get people invested in helping change laws. And I just think you gave great advice there, man. Like, take the initiative, take 10 minutes out of your day to call somebody in power and just ask questions. And if the answers they give you don't make sense, take 10 more minutes to Google some things and reach out to people that actually can tell you what's going on. So kudos to you for telling people that. And this is an important topic. We have to keep unpacking. We got to keep talking about it because you and I have seen how youth justice funnels people into the adult prison system, and that's not the outcome we want. So we shouldn't agree with the process that's achieving that outcome.
That's right.
So just want to, shout out everybody for listening in. Always, we appreciate you, and, stay tuned because we're going to be doing more and more episodes about juvenile justice. And like I said, talking to people with firsthand experience and knowledge about what we need to change. And we're going to keep exploring all the other topics that are important too and telling people stories. And
subscribe to the podcast.
Yeah, subscribe. Look us up on social media, Instagram, @BehindTheDoor Maine, Facebook, @BehindTheDoor. Subscribe, download, tune in. And also, if you haven't seen them yet, we got some pretty badass t-shirts. So reach out and buy a t-shirt too because they're pretty awesome. Subscribe. What should they do, Jeremy? Subscribe. All right. Thank you, everybody.